indeed. Does that sound all right? Is that okay? Can you hear me at the back all right? I'll just raise my voice. Okay, there we go. So my specialism then is in geographical information science. That is to say, beyond just the standard information systems that we traditionally think about, that there is something very exciting about the geographic dimension, and that we devote a lot of time, energy, and effort to capturing that geographic dimension. And GIS is particularly relevant to the topics that we've been hearing about this morning, because it's all about extracting value from every move that we make. So our capacity to record the information and to record the geography of what we do is what makes GIS such a potent technology. So I want to give you some of my thoughts about this, and I want to briefly turn to a case study that I hope will articulate some of those ideas. We live in a technologically deterministic world. That is to say, technology governs so much of how society develops. What I want to argue, for those of you who fall asleep during this presentation, is that the integration of information, of particularly geographic information, is something that erodes the notion of privacy, something I want to try and attempt a definition of, that this type of technology selectively empowers, that I would argue that all forms of technology are inherently undemocratic, that we need to think carefully about that socio-technical issue, that we need to think about those cultural dimensions in the way that we use this type of information. That's my take-home message. Okay, so what is the vision of technology? Well, I think the vision of technology I've tried to summarize on this slide here. The vision is of mass participation, the capacity for the public at large to engage with solving the world's problems today. I think there's another vision about the way in which communities can articulate their needs. And I'm reminded of Murray Bookchin's libertarian municipalism, his vision of power being vested in the localized community. It's very interesting how information is being captured, being voluntarily given. This is where people actively participate in the capture of information. It's this idea of the masses, the wisdom of the masses, being able to do projects like OpenStreetMap and Wikimapia. They kind of very much follow that vision that collectively everybody can contribute to some grand vision by which we can make access to all free to this type of mapped data. And then, of course, there is the benign or the hidden collection of data, just the very process of you moving through space, unwittingly providing a great deal of geographic information, which, when combined with other information, as we've heard about, enables us to learn a great deal about what you do, where you go, and what you do when you go. So what do I think are the concerns? What are the issues that I think are worth talking about? And in some ways, these have been nicely articulated by the previous speaker. First of all, I want to talk about the nature of technology and argue that it's undemocratic. I also want to argue that our obsession and preference for looking at the world through the technological lens gives us a rather skewed vision of that world. I want to look briefly at how technology erodes privacy through its increasing levels of precision, both in space and time, and that we also risk making inference from that data. And finally, that this idea of a panopticon society, that the fusion of geographic information technology creates these panoptic societies. Why do I think GIS, or technology in general, is inherently undemocratic? Well, it's because it requires particular skills, particular knowledge. It requires access to that information. And if we read the works of Pickles and Ghosh and Peluso, then they talk about the way in which technology is inherently elitist and undemocratic. And we often think about the digital divide. It's a commonly understood notion. I think that digital divide exists across societies at multiples of... It's unlimitedly differentiatable from digital divides at a global scale, at a national scale, at a community scale, all the way down to the smallest group of individuals. It will always be, to some degree, I would argue, divisive. Secondly, the geography in which the world in which we live today is not discrete, it's not a Legoland, and it contains people. And I think that sometimes the ways in which we compartmentalize that world into discrete objects belies the fact that the world is a very rich and complex world, and that there are certain dimensions, many dimensions to it, that cannot necessarily be captured in a quantitative form. In fact, I think that's actually what drives government's obsession with trying to gather more and more data in order to try and beat terrorism, but that there are actually some very complex dimensions to social processes of every type and sort that are very, very difficult to capture. I think we like to think that information is captured in interesting ways, for example, through Twitter and Flickr and OpenStreetMap, but that these are actually quite small populations of people. The notion of sort of mass participation, I think, is a little bit generous. And I think that often we talk about participatory science without really exploring and understanding what people's motives are for participating in that process. The other thing, too, that I think is interesting about the technology is the degree to which it erodes at least our locational privacy. There were a list, I think, that Professor Rab put on the board about what different components to what privacy is defined as. But if we just think of it in terms of locational privacy, knowing where you are, then there's a range of external and indoor technologies that enable us to know more and more about exactly where you are. This is an interesting map, a graph. It shows an event on the 2nd of May 2000. This was legislation passed by Bill Clinton, I think. And this was the point at which, at 2 a.m. on the 2nd of May in the year 2000, the selective availability of GPS satellites was switched off. Effectively, there was a deliberate noise introduced in GPS signals so that it was vague as to exactly where you were, up to a distance of about 100 meters. And it was switched off so that civilians could then actually identify people's location to a much finer and finer level of detail. And so you can see the precision is significantly increased through that technology. And so instead of randomly knowing roughly where somebody was, and I don't know, but the technology now is kind of enabling us, I think, to move to these finer and finer levels of knowing exactly where you are. And whilst many of you would be quite happy to know that, oh, I'm in Edinburgh, there are finer and finer levels of detail to the point at which you start to say, well, actually, there's a level at which you've invaded my privacy. So I think of locational privacy is a person's capacity to be anonymous. And I think with increasing precision of technology, that capacity to be anonymous is increasingly eroded and taken away from you. This is a map, this is a graph. It shows a very strong correlation between the number of people who drowned whilst in swimming pools against power generated by nuclear power plants in the US from 1999 to the year 2009. What we see is a very, very good correlation here. And although it's a humorous attempt to make the point that often we look at these types of correlations and make causal links between them. I think that technology sometimes leads us to undertake these kinds of ecological fallacies. The other thing, too, that technology does, and certainly our capacity to gather this information and to combine it, it's the capacity to combine. It was very nicely articulated in the previous the capacity to integrate different databases and to take advantage of knowing that geographic waterprint that exists in everything that we do, that watermark. It enables us to map in all sorts of different ways. So here's a map showing levels of deprivation for London. And the reason why, so we might argue that there's any map and any sort of map like this, we can say, well, now we know a lot more about our communities. The problem is, in this particular instance, is there a risk that it might ghettoise certain institutions, certain communities? It might be that the wealthy people are able to move out of these communities, and actually for a community that is perhaps already deprived, to become increasingly so, because there will always be a proportion of that community that isn't able to escape. And so, does technology, the byproducts of technology, can it marginalise communities that are already vulnerable? And then, as I said, my sixth item is this idea of a panopticon society. This is from the work of Jeremy Bentham from 1785. He was an English philosopher, and he was interested in designing prisons. The ideal prison being one in which a single watchtower could watch over the masses. And the idea of this whole, one of the kind of core proposals or ideas inherent in this vision is that the prisoners can't see the guard. And so therefore there is this sense of being constantly surveyed. And what I worry about is whether that panopticon society that I argue, that I feel that we have become, is it one that has become a conforming society? My question to you would be, would these people participate if they knew that their identity was known to the government, to the police, to their employer? And I even wondered about the absence of people on the other side of the Berlin Wall. Maybe they did indeed have that fear, which has made them behave in a particular way that's very different to these people here. Foucault talks about the idea of the panopticon society inducing a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. And so I would think that projects like Tempora and Prism, work being done by GCHQ, these are examples in which we create these virtual panopticon societies. Okay, so for the second part of my talk, I want to just leap away and introduce you to, take you quickly through a piece of research that was undertaken by Candela Espeso. And we were interested in this idea of mapping vulnerable communities. And we took as our inspiration the work that's been done in a large slum in Nairobi in Kenya called Map Kibera. And this was an attempt to collectively energize the community in collecting information about themselves. So here is Pune. It's a city of about 6 million people. And within the city itself, there are about 477 slums. The particular one that we chose to focus on was Shankar Maharaj. Shankar Maharaj has about 3,000 people living in it, 800 dwellings. And so what we did was we through an NGO, through an architectural NGO, we looked to work with the people who were living in the slum to ask them what it was that they thought that technology could be used to either map or improve the way in which they operate. And these are vibrant, well-established. This one here has been here for 10 years and provides a place by which people can readily commute to work. There's water outside the houses, there's communal toilets. These are just some of the images to try and give you a sort of a picture of and here is a small nursery school as well. So these are comprehensive, well-organized structures. And so what we did was we conducted a series of meetings in which we sought to try and find out what it was that we could do that would enable people to map their environment and to find out how they might utilize information gathered by the people within the slum to make the slum more efficient, perhaps better engage with local government, to improve qualities of facilities, to be able to write grant proposals and identify grants in order to get money to improve their facilities. That was a Freudian slip. And so we used a range of paper-based technologies and GPS handheld units in order to gather that information. And we made a series of observations when we had worked through these various exercises. And I want to just quickly go through these five bullet points. So the first is that the use of this technology needs to sit within ideas of governance and governability. That we need to acknowledge, of course, that there are already within the slum existing forms of empowerment structures and ways of knowing and sharing information. Perhaps technology does not necessarily emancipate, but perhaps reinforce existing structures. That the very process of engagement is actually perhaps more collusion and a form of subjugation. And that the codification of knowledge can actually weaken an institution and certainly its custodians. So let me just elaborate a little bit briefly on each of those in turn. So the first is that we need to think carefully about how these are ideas drawn from Foucault and his ideas of the role played by various individuals and institutions in being able to manage a particular environment. So for example, in undertaking this project in which we're gathering information about individuals, then we need to frame that within the political ambition of India's slum eradication program. So there you have an immediate tension between the people people occupying the slum wishing to ensure their preservation, and the government's ambition, which lies completely as an antithesis to that. And sometimes we don't think carefully enough about these issues, and it creates these conflicts in terms of access to and the sharing of information. The second idea is that there are already these pre-existing informal and formal empowerment structures that exist. So the guy sitting down here in the left-hand corner is Santosh Geli. We'll come to him in the next slide. Here we are talking, this is Mandela doing work in which he's meeting with the women of the slum to ask them what it is that they think, how they think this technology could be used to empower and to help make lives better for themselves within the community. But it was interesting that Santosh came along to these meetings. Normally, the meeting would just be amongst the women, but his presence here is significant. And that's because two of the people who stepped forward and volunteered in the collection and the recording of the data were Santosh Geli and Santosh Abhang. And these are both both related to their mother, who is a resident community volunteer, a family that managed to raise its status and actually move out of the slum. And so what's happening here is that rather than utilising the technology in a way that can be shared and engaging all of the people within the community, these two people who already had authority within the slum stepped forward, and the very process of engaging with us actually had an empowering effect on their already established power within that community. So these were already important figures, and that the participation process reinforced that, rather than adjusting any of those power relationships that exist within the slum. But not just within the slum, but of course there are also these external links between the NGO, between the government, the local government, the government's rehabilitation authority, urban and community development. There's a whole network of processes going on here. When the data was collected, they asked if we would share the data with them. Was that used as a mechanism, as an organ of power through which they could further control and manipulate the slum? Going back to the idea of governability. And then there's this other issue that when we start to gather information, particularly in the context of oral traditions, then the authority of that original custodian is weakened. Now, I gave you the example there of the slum in India, but I would argue that for any consensual unit, whether it be a local wind farm community group or whether it be a group of people within a slum in India, that I think many of these issues still exist and still arise and still sit, that the technology actually sits as a thin veneer across a very complex web of social interactions. We need to keep in mind, of course, that there's an indulgence into all of the things that I'm saying, that there is, in many contexts, a necessity to gather information now. So map my rights, the idea of counter-mapping, the idea of map or be mapped, vulnerable communities being removed from land in certain developing countries. So there is an urgency to gather this type of information. And we need to acknowledge, though, that technology sits within that complex set of relationships. There are, of course, multiple benefits to that technology. But whether or not it has a capacity to redistribute power and to alter those power structures fundamentally, I think actually that technology leans the other way. If we want it to really address issues of participation and to really enable people to feel that they are empowered, I think we have to work very hard at that. So then, in conclusion, I think technology is a privileged discourse. I think it plays a role in subjugation. I think we need to think really carefully about how we address the naturally exclusory nature of information technology. We need to understand much more deeply what it is that motivates people to participate in all forms of projects. And that all of these things can only work effectively if they're thought within legal frameworks and political strategies. The collection of data is a political act in every sense of the word and at every level. And that's why I think we need to think carefully about how we utilize information. Thanks very much.
Well, very many thanks to William for that very thought-provoking talk. And I like the idea of mapping or being mapped. a very stark choice. We've got time for a few questions, so are there any who'd like to start? Over there.
So maps have long been a weapon in the sense that in this country, ordnance survey, ordnance. Do you think maps are a good way of reflecting the fact that here's a way, and any collection of information is effectively, can be used as a weapon if put in the wrong hands? Or is it particular to maps? So does the analogy cross beyond the geographic?
Yeah, so it's quite easy to use immersive terms, isn't it? I always feel very nervous about the issue of falling into the wrong hands. Use. I often hear and I just think that we need to mapping data is not a lot different from any other form of data. That capacity to provide a context. So I think that's what makes map has become an organising structure.
Thank you. I was interested in your discussion of the marginalisation of the vulnerable. If you go back to the 1950s, when people started studying systems and felt that studying everyone in a system was too expensive, so we would sample. If you then take sampling through a technological frame, you tend to sample those who are the most visible, the most powerful, and so on, and you reinforce that. But isn't it arguable that big data might give us the chance to actually look at the edges of the distribution? And whilst some of those people are excluded from technology completely, we are at least able to probe those much weaker signals representing those more marginalized communities. And it's really just a completely different way of looking at the edges of a distribution now rather than that central distribution. So big data could be a good thing in that respect.
Yes. How are you imagining those marginalized communities would have some kind of digital footprint that you could capture about them? Yes.
It's the bit as a statistician you wouldn't use because it's less certain, but you are picking up the boundaries between those people who are inside the frame and powerful and those people who are on the margins of the frame as you go across. It was those multiple digital divides you pointed out before at different levels. They produce very weak signals in the data, and it's only if you get all the data you have a chance of seeing some of those weaker signals.
So absolutely, and I think that all that's not all that is required. What is required is for us to acknowledge just the noise and the uncertainty in that data. I think there is information in there. Sometimes the uncertainty and the fuzziness of the data is something we're too quick to Could be good. Yes. We just need to attach caveats to things. I think that's why it's hazardous. I was going to put up a poster of somebody in their biochemical suit, and it's this idea that it is potentially hazardous we're dealing with, and we just need to believe it. It would be a wonderful thing, isn't it, every time we went to handle information, because it was a little bit, I'm sure, but we'll take the lid off this. We just need to be a bit more cautious, I think.
One more question, I think, please.
Okay, I mean, you put the context in terms of politics, and you seem to be talking about control. I mean, people's control versus perhaps government control or corporation control, which raises to me the question of where openness fits into that, because you mentioned OpenStreetMap, and I wasn't quite sure whether you thought OpenStreetMap was a good thing because it's people mapping themselves or a bad thing, and perhaps that's the thing you're commenting on. There are obviously other areas of openness. There's open source versus private source within the IT world, and then open data versus privately held data. But perhaps focus on the OpenStreetMap. Do you see that as a good thing? Do you see that as giving control back to people, or is it taking control elsewhere?
Look at, people often use the word crowdsourced, but actually these can be tiny populations of people who are involved in collecting that data. I wouldn't want to say OpenStreetMap is a good or a bad thing. I think what it is important to realise is that it is data motivations, particular ambitions, topic thing, or whether it's an attempt to try and so I think it's we ban the term crowdsourced. I think knowledge the quality of OpenStreetMap, there is huge, and that's driven by people's as an exercise. I think it's fascinating. What bias that introduces.
Okay, well, thanks very much again to William and to the people who asked questions. The discussion there was very interesting, and I think, yeah, thank you.